Welcome to the next talk. I want to introduce you to Carlos. He's giving his talk about the future of work, redefining apprenticeship with a holistic perspective. And I give it over to you, Carlos.
Let's do it. All right, hey everyone. Good afternoon. Switch tabs here. Not yet, Brian. All right, now we're going full screen. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carlos Vasquez. I'm actually the founder of an education technology nonprofit based in Miami called Miami EdTech. And I'm really excited to share what we've been working on over the past 2 years. It's kind of our little launch week. Our product has gone live, and we're also here in New York, back in my hometown. I actually grew up a stone's throw away in the South Bronx, right across the bridge on the other side. Pretty much 10 minutes away in terms of geography, but probably very far away in terms of the socioeconomic status and makeup of that neighborhood. So I feel really lucky and privileged to be here today and present to you really some of my life's work in a sense. I graduated from Fordham University with a degree in computer science a long time ago. It's 20 years ago now. Sounds crazy to say. And I've been at the intersection of education, technology, and social justice, really. I operate under the thesis that your zip code should not dictate your life outcomes. And I've dedicated my life and my work to ensuring that we create pathways to support young people and really career changers into opportunities and careers that provide more than just a livable wage. I feel really fortunate that I had really powerful mentors who were able to guide me along the way. And I've tried to be that for folks that I've worked with. And I started as a 5th grade teacher here in New York City, not too far from where I went to college. And then I transitioned to working at a nonprofit called Year Up in the Bay Area in San Francisco. And it was there where I really got to see through my work with the tech companies, we're talking the Fortune 50 large tech companies. And my job was to go there and figure out how do we create curriculum that helps create pathways for non-traditional or non-traditionally educated students. So I kind of say it was basically like being and I have a family member who was a Marine and felt very Navy SEAL-like to hop in there and try to figure out what does it take to get someone not from an Ivy League school with access to that curriculum and experience to work there. And, we're facing an unprecedented skills gap. We're at, even before the pandemic, we were already entering a skills gap. We saw college enrollment decline. And so as I've pretty much been in the front lines of many major workforce initiatives, and I decided to take a step back. I said, we need to let's look at the past. And, I really was kind of hitting my head on the wall, and I worked for various and consulted for various companies that were also addressing the skills gap and the digital divide. And in looking back in time, not too long ago, well, I guess the Middle Ages is a long time, but not the Sorcerer's Apprentice. That came out maybe 10 years ago. Actually, no, 2010. But for those of you who are not familiar with the topic of apprenticeship or how an apprenticeship works, the goal of today is to talk about the apprenticeship, what makes for an apprenticeship, and how do we use the apprenticeship model to close the skills gap and to provide pathways for individuals who traditionally are disconnected from careers. And my particular specialty is STEM, but the apprenticeship model and the framework can be used and has been used across pretty much every industry. So when I first started, having worked in an internship program like Year Up, when I first started the research, I asked plenty of people in my network if they were familiar with the apprenticeship model. And what I noticed was that everyone used the internship and apprenticeship term interchangeably. People were not aware of the difference between an apprenticeship and an internship. And I'll ask you all, if you want to just think about it, those of you in the room who are here present, raise your hand if you are familiar with what it means to have an apprenticeship program. Okay, awesome. And it's very common. It is the norm in Europe, in many countries in Europe. And here in the US, it's picked up over the past, I would say, 20 years. So we fast forwarded from the Middle Ages to 1911. So hopefully, I'm sure a lot of things happened there, but we're going to focus on the century here and look at Wisconsin, who created the first apprenticeship. And really, under President Obama's administration, the lens of workforce and looking at models that we could enhance access, we kind of put the apprenticeship model under a microscope. And there were a couple of things that we learned that prevented companies from launching apprenticeship programs, despite being such a proven workforce model, not just in the past, but in present in countries, as I mentioned, in Europe. And one of the biggest changes that was made in the apprenticeship model was actually the incorporation of a competency-based approach, which differed from the traditional hour-based approach. So if you knew, for example, your job as a web developer required you to, if you were an apprentice as a web developer and you needed to know COBOL, and you had to do that over 150 hours, with the change, the company could actually create an assessment that would help you, bypass the 150 hours. It might still take you 150 hours, but at least you had the option to take an assessment to then move on into a different competency. So there have been some major changes and major funding that has gone into the apprenticeship model and apprenticeships overall, including the creation of a consortium of companies. I think there were about 25 business leaders who come together to rethink it. But let's demystify the idea of an apprenticeship. So what is an apprenticeship? And to keep in mind, the key difference between an apprenticeship and an internship is an internship is really more about general experience, general work experience, whereas your apprentice is really focused on a specific role, learning specifically from someone on the job, which is that person's mentor. So these 5 pillars make up the apprenticeship. And I'll chat a little bit about each pillar here. First and foremost, which might also sometimes differ from those lovely free internships that sometimes are offered, apprenticeships are paid. And this is a paradigm shift as it relates to what we think of supporting talent that might not be already, quote unquote, qualified for the job, because you're paying them to learn and to learn specifically from someone on the job. So traditionally, the hourly rate for an apprentice is anywhere between 15, 17, 18, depends on the role, but that's your typical entry level pay. After that, the fact that it's paid, first and foremost, there's also what's called on-the-job learning or work-based learning. And this is where a lot of companies struggle. A lot of companies struggle with creating structured on-the-job learning. You usually show up, they throw you to the wolves, you're expected to keep up, or they pay a salary that's at the max because they want someone who already comes in with a certain level of experience. So work-based learning or structured learning, this is where a lot of agencies come in to consult and help companies, especially in an era where we have many subject matter experts and folks who are retiring that are leaving with a particular depth of knowledge that once they're gone, the company potentially loses access to that. So more and more companies are investing in ways to transfer that knowledge transfer into structured learning opportunities, which is why I'm sure this conference will always be available and people will always talk about that. Mentorship, another key pillar of the apprenticeship experience, is a mentor. So this is where we start to transition to the holistic perspective of the apprenticeship experience. Mentorship has always been a key component. What you're going to hear in this presentation are ways to kind of enhance that holistic approach that is touched upon in mentorship, but really there's opportunities to do it at a deeper, larger scale. Classroom learning is another component of an apprenticeship. So outside of the structured on the job, you can do classroom learning in the classroom during work hours or after quote unquote work hours. So there's some flexibility there, but the idea behind on-the-job training and classroom learning or job-related education is that you're getting supplemental learning that's closely tied to the job, but it might not be directly related to your role. And finally, your credential. So with a credential, it's a way to track your progression through a role. So if you start as a junior developer, you work your way potentially to a mid-level developer, a senior developer. There's a very transparent process or cycle that the apprentice goes through, which as a principle of adult learning, adults want to know how what they're doing is going to impact their life and their bank accounts. So the apprenticeship, a key role in the apprenticeship is actually wage progression and tracking wage progression. So given all of these things now about the apprenticeship program and the future of work, why don't we have more apprenticeships in the United States? Well, as you can see, it's a lot. And what I saw in my research and speaking with directors of apprenticeship programs throughout the country, even in different parts of the world, it's an administrative nightmare. It's a headache. It's timesheets. And I really felt like we went back into the Middle Ages as I started to review and hear from some of the challenges that folks faced. So with that being said, there was also a lack of training and support. So one story that I remember in speaking with an apprentice at a top 10 company, Fortune 5 company, was that after they finished the initial training, kind of were just dumped into as a regular almost employee, as basically just, okay, you're an apprentice, but there was no support structure built around this apprentice. He felt as if he was just treated as someone who just kind of came out of, a four-year college, or he felt that there was no support, that there wasn't good communication between that initial training and on the ground. And that's a theme that I heard throughout my interviews with apprentices and apprenticeship directors. And so I started to think, what can we do? How do we use technology in this era of SaaS and models like Workday and project management tools like Trello? How do we create something that actually supports both sides, employer, apprentice, even on the manager side? Because look at the growth. So here you'll see since 2012, we've seen a 64% growth annually in apprenticeships. Not only has there been a significant level of in terms of the number, but also in funding. Just recently, the current president and administration also put together billions of dollars towards revamping our current apprenticeship model. And rightly so. There are two key points. The ROI of apprenticeship, their studies have shown for every dollar invested, there's a return of $1.47, and a public return for every dollar, that's $28 in benefits. So this is recent research that's showing that if you invest in talent, in apprenticeship or an apprentice, you're doing well for your company and for society. And over the long run, you end up having a more dedicated, flexible, and loyal workforce because of there's a trade that happens there. There's an understanding that you're investing in me to learn in your company. And that's a loyalty that develops naturally through that exchange. So I said, okay, so what is at the heart of this besides the administrative details? Well, the other challenges and I heard this from managers who managed apprentices, was that they didn't know how to translate their skill, their expertise, how they had gotten somewhere after 20 years into a learning experience for someone new. They were busy, they're busy, they have, deadlines. So I said, okay, that makes sense. So this, what we call an expert blind spot, we need to figure out a way to create that more naturally. And there's tons of frameworks that I've kind of looked at and researched to figure out, especially around cognitive task analysis and many other different studies. But for me, I said, there's got to be a way to use technology, and that's what we started to look at. So as I researched the different types of tools that currently are used They were task focused, very administrative. So you use Excel or you use something else that looks like Excel. It's just another timesheet tracker. What did you do? How long did you do it for? Did your manager approve? And I said, you know what? That's not fair. That's not a fair way to look at an employee. To think just and only, especially in this era, which we're calling Great Resignation. Folks are looking for more, want to feel more involved, want to feel more supported, more flexibility. So how do we reinvent or redefine this apprenticeship model to make sure that we're supporting the entire person? So this idea of the entire person, I started to reflect on and realize, first of all, Brene Brown, for those of you who do not know, amazing researcher, speaker, TEDx, and in a TEDx, no, it was actually an interview with LinkedIn. She said something so powerful, and it came at such a right time in the research of this holistic approach to the apprenticeship. She said she interviewed championship winning sports teams, large enterprises, and she said that what she heard was that these leaders would always say, I need all of you. I need everything from you. I want you to bring everything to work. And she said, well, if you need everything or all of someone, then you have to create a culture that supports the wholeness of humanity and psychological safety. And that to me, something really resonated, because that is what I saw as a missing piece in the apprenticeship framework. The idea of addressing the whole, not just thinking, okay, you spoke to your manager, you submitted this paperwork and you submitted it, let me clock out and have a good day. Because that doesn't cultivate the wholeness of the person, or even not just the employee, but the manager as well. So in continuing to research, I said, okay, 94% of employees say that they would stay at a company longer if it invested in their career development. Ding, 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 94%. So if you feel that they are investing in you, you feel a higher sense of loyalty and staying. Now imagine you couple that with wage progression and a platform that makes that whole experience more transparent and tangible. So in using tech to create culture, I went down a rabbit hole trying to think about tech and culture, and stumbled upon another, Brene Brown, where she talked about the number one trait of high performing teams. I should have had this slide empty and asked you all to guess what, this is actually three, but they were bundled together. Vulnerability, trust, and psychological safety. Those are the three key pillars of a high performing team. And these sometimes are considered, they say, soft skills, right? These things that, you know, how do you develop these things? Well, that's where I saw technology fitting in. Technology kind of on the back end is the vehicle to create this, but how do you do that? How do you cultivate that? And I started to think about my experiences being very vulnerable in an environment where I felt that I couldn't be vulnerable. My first job. So my first job, I have a computer science degree, you know, here I am ready to take on the world, ready to fix every technical problem on the job. And on day one, I get sent to change the ink toner in the printer. Okay, put this expensive degree to work here. Where is it? Let's do it. Are you sure you know how to do it? Absolutely. It's ink. Come on, I've changed it millions of times. So I get in the room. I've never seen a machine like this before in my life. It was half the size of the room. So I said, I was afraid to ask for help. I mean, here I am, the new guy, on the job, CS degree. Come on, Carlos, you could change the ink. So I ended up pulling out a cartridge that was not supposed to be pulled out, and ink went everywhere, all over my clothes, all over my hands. And if you ever had an experience with ink, it's not something you could quickly go wash off. So on top of already dealing with imposter syndrome, just being there, someone, first person in my family to graduate college, insert, you know, a lot of the characteristics that come with coming from my zip code. And I was afraid to ask for help. And it would have taken 5 minutes if there was a culture of vulnerability, of support. But it actually took more courage than we realized to be vulnerable, than I realized. So I started to think about apprentices who probably are feeling the same way, imposter syndrome. Here they are. I started thinking about the conversations I was having with apprentices in top 5 tech companies who are showing up day one after your training and saying, okay, go, you can do this now. And I said, imagine that, a scenario where you're given a task, you don't know how to do it. There wasn't a there isn't a culture of vulnerability or just communication. Some people have it naturally to personality. That happens too. But how do we make that more consistent? And I started thinking about one more experience. Here, not too long after that first job, I was at a company and they were living in the Middle Ages, this theme of the Middle Ages. They were using satellite waves to share internet. I don't know what that's 1 kilobit. I have no idea. But I said in a volunteer effort, hey, I can help you all get on. We're going to get on DSL. No problem. I'll figure this out. Crashed the network for 2 days. And it was rough. That hurt. And I didn't know who to ask because there was actually no one else on staff. They hired me to be the person. So I ended up inside of an AOL chat room asking around who can help me. These are the specs. And I remember, I think it was Brian from Nebraska who said, oh, we have those specs over here, Carlos. Why don't you give me a call and I'll walk you through it? And guess what? Look, Brian walked me through fixing this solution. I crowdsourced the answer. We have Reddit now. We do look at forums. We had AOL in my day. So we went to a chat room and that's how we figured it out. So those two things, the culture of vulnerability and then having someone you could ask for help, I knew needed to be embedded in what we're calling Go Sprout, the platform. Because technology is that objective vehicle that's going to create and bring out that space. You have to use a timesheet. You have to do this. You have this as a backbone. We use Slack to communicate. So how do we use a tool that does that? And that's what Go Sprout is. So Go Sprout, keeping all those things in mind that we've chatted in terms of the future of work, allows for an apprentice to request an intervention, request support, give manager feedback, and back and forth feedback. So we really started to think about Malcolm Knowles' assumptions of adult learners. So we started to think, so I took it to the next level. I said, I want to make sure that we recognize that when we deal with adults, we deviate from pedagogy. We're talking about adults, andragogy, right? So we have to, a lot of the concepts that companies use to incentivize employees are not actually tied to what employees and adults want. So if we can find a way, for example, to activate self-concept and think about as you're moving, again, from being dependent, you're an apprentice, you are so dependent. This is your lifeline, this person who's next to you, teaching you, dedicated to helping you develop. Some do it better than others, right? So how do we create that experience? So we have embedded the processes in the platform that do that. Thinking about this growing reservoir of experiences, or I call it a repository, right? Because there's no greater learning that can happen than when there's a crisis or a need. Learners operate at their peak when it has to directly solve something. So if we just show up and I have a PowerPoint, this is front-end web development, and this is back-end web development, and say hello world, and this, hey, you all will get paid $50, or we go to dinner tonight if you can make a website for this restaurant across the street, right? Like when you give a challenge, so that's part of the Go Sprout experience. They start to collect it. Not only does the apprentice do it, but the manager does it too. So the manager is also able to log experiences that they may have had, so the apprentice can then read the log of the manager's experiences. So they might not get it, in the beginning, but as they start to develop, there's going to be a point where they kind of align and they're like, oh, and then that's when that apprentice, if this person leaves, continues that journey of development that was shared in the repository of the manager. Another principle here, readiness to learn. I think that's inherent. And given time, I'm going to kind of push through these, but I do invite you all, if you haven't, to kind of explore this. And there were also principles. So my point is that on top of the administrative tasks that this product solves, I wanted to make sure that it help someone, sprout, I'm going to say it. That's where we obviously got the name from. And on top of that, we are currently working with Education Design Lab to connect micro-credentials to that apprenticeship experience. So we want to now, the same way in a micro-credential you present, you have to share and you get evaluated. We want to bring the real apprenticeship job experiences so that they earn badges tied to what they're doing in their job. The manager sees it, and there's like a whole kind of team that's reviewing. So these competencies already have skills associated. So we allow an apprentice to log when they took a walk, when they had a tough conversation, when they're feeling, I don't want to say down, I think when they're feeling challenged, right? We now create that holistic perspective. So if you had a challenging time, like the ink toner that spilled all over your pants, I would log that, because that would be something that would be valuable to kind of see through the scope of my experience or the person's experience, how they overcame that. You present that, well, I overcame it. I had to go home early and change, but at the same time, now, I realized I needed to ask for help. And that was an interesting lesson there. I'll stop there right on time, and that's Go Sprout and redefining apprenticeships through a holistic perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. Are there any questions here in the room? I think we don't have questions in the online world.
I'm curious how they are familiar with apprenticeships. How are you familiar with the model?
Are you?
We have a different model. I work for a university.
Okay.
What we do is we try to link companies with professors teaching classes. So instead of doing apprenticeship, we ask them to give us a project. So give me a 5-week project, and that way you have a professor that's helping you translate your ideas into teaching, and the students have an incentive. I mean, they have to do the project to pass the class.
Right.
And
That's
the incentive for the company is you get to see my students 2 years before everybody else, so you can start picking up the right people for your company in the future.
That's great. Yeah, we need more of that type of.
But it takes a lot of work to get many companies, and professors to work together for courses.
Yeah, another event that inspired me was there was a company. I'm based in South Florida, in Miami. They had just raised $60 million in a Series B. And I was like, oh, you probably would love to have apprenticeships or interns. And they said, we don't have the bandwidth for that. So I was like, so there's something that even monetary fundraising, doesn't mean your culture can handle bandwidth of people and talent, especially apprenticeship or intern or entry level. So we've been talking. They're gonna run a pilot. Got to sell them, but at the same time, it shows you the mentality that we have. It's a paradigm shift that we have to kind of go through. You're tackling it by giving the early access, and you're like opening their minds to say, like, this is what they could do in 5 weeks. Imagine what they could be trained to do over X amount of time.
And students do a great job.
Of course.
Most of the time they come up, people in companies are impressed. They said, I mean, I didn't expect all this quality from people who are just in the middle of a career. And it's a win-win situation, but it really takes a lot of work on the side of the teachers, and a lot of work on the side of the
Yeah, there's like a curve there where the initial bandwidth, the initial investment of time starts to dwindle, but that's also a financial thing too, because you pay less for your apprentice, and over time they develop the skills, or you pay at the top of the mountain, right? So yeah, that's really, really interesting. Good point.
I think like in this country, at least, is the stereotype of like apprenticeship. When I think of apprenticeships, is like working trades, like electricians, plumbers. That's kind of like. But you're talking about apprenticeships also, in all different kinds of jobs. So I just think that
Yeah, the engineering, STEM, pretty much under STEM.
Like when you go out, like you see people working out on buildings here.
Yeah.
They went through some kind of apprenticeship to be an electrician and be licensed in New York or whatever, right? And there's a tradition of that with like the working trades.
Agreed. My father-in-law was an apprentice. He's an electrician many years. So a lot of the UI and the UX is like super user-friendly in the sense of like so we thought about that. Who's going to be accessing it? You might not have the most, digitally advanced folks, but more and more people are getting pushed into having to do something online. And I think if they could, like, instead of getting to a timesheet that gets coffee spilled and all these things, it's worth the experiment. And there's funding to do so too now. So
I'm from Germany, and a big part of our educational system is on the basis of apprenticeship, and it's very, very successful. But we have a dual system. It's a combination from working at a company, but also going to a so-called vocational school.
Right.
Something like that here in the US, because it helps the companies pretty much, because they don't always have all the knowledge that's needed to provide a very good education for the apprentices. So this combination works very fine. And at the end in Germany, there is an evaluation from the Chamber of Commerce, and then you get your certificate. And it's all standardized all over Germany. So everybody who has this kind of certificate can go to an employer, can say, hey, here, I had my apprenticeship as an electrician, as a carpenter, or whatever.
Like standardized.
Yes,
basically.
it's standardized, and that's very, very, very good.
And that's what they're trying to do with these credentials too. Like empathy, that concept is very subjective sometimes. So if you can create the behaviors that demonstrate that, kind of standardize it a little bit. But how do we do that? We need to ask and elicit, the information. Germany obsessed with the models. I think it works really well, and the concept where the company feels like a burden is taken off when the apprentice goes to learn somewhere else in terms of the university teaching or the institutional partner. And I think here they see it as a burden in a way. Like here, like, oh, you gotta go get that class, sure, go, right? So it's a big paradigm shift in mindset that we have to do. But done. Yeah, we'll keep fighting. Well, thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you
so much
again.
Of course.
And thank you
for
for your attention on the online world.